Do you remember those simple, hearty meals that once filled Appalachian kitchens and country tables? Dishes made from what was on hand: beans, cabbage, pork scraps, and whatever the garden or woods provided, each one full of flavor and ingenuity. Somehow, over time, these practical, comforting hillbilly dinners slipped out of our everyday cooking, replaced by convenience foods and fast meals. Today, we're digging into 30 of these forgotten classics, celebrating the resourcefulness, tradition, and soul that made them unforgettable. Soup, beans, and cornbread. If there was ever a dish that defined the heart of hillbilly cooking, it was soup, beans, and cornbread. Simple, humble, and endlessly comforting, this meal fed Appalachian families through winters, hard times, and long days of honest work. You didn't need much, just dried pinto beans, a hunk of salt pork or ham hock, water, and patience. The beans simmered for hours until the kitchen filled with the smell of something wholesome and familiar. And when they were ready, you didn't serve them alone. You served them with a golden slice of cornbread, hot from the skillet, ready to soak up every drop. For mountain families, soup beans weren't just food, they were tradition. A pot of beans on the stove meant you were home, even if you didn't have much else. Cornbread, made from meal ground at the local mill, was often baked in bacon grease or lard, giving it that crispy edge that made each bite better than the last. Some topped their bowl with chopped onions or spoonfuls of chow chow relish. Others just crumbled cornbread right into the beans, letting it soak up the broth until it became pure comfort in a bowl. What made this dish so timeless was its honesty. It wasn't trying to impress anyone. It was about nourishment, warmth, and community. Neighbors sharing a pot when times were lean, or families gathering around the table after church. Today, you might find fancier versions dressed up in restaurants, but none can match the flavor of a home-cooked pot made with love and thrift. Soup, beans, and cornbread weren't just a meal. They were a reminder that even the simplest ingredients can fill both stomach and soul. It's proof that real comfort food doesn't need a recipe, just a pot, some patience, and a little heart. Fried taters and onions. Few things smell as good as the skillet of fried taters and onions sizzling away on a country stove. It was the sound of home, the soft hiss of hot grease, the sharp scent of onions caramelizing, and the earthy warmth of potatoes turning golden brown. This dish wasn't fancy, but it didn't need to be. It was a working man's supper, a breakfast for dinner favorite, and sometimes the only thing standing between a family and an empty belly. All it took was a handful of potatoes, an onion, a bit of fat, usually bacon grease, and a hot cast iron skillet. Fried taters and onions were the definition of thrift and comfort rolled into one. Leftover potatoes from the night before? Slice them thin, toss them in the pan, and give them new life. A few onions stretched the flavor even further, adding sweetness and depth that made the dish taste like more than it was. You could add sausage, ham, or even a fried egg on top if payday had been kind. But even plain, it was pure satisfaction. The kind of meal that made you scrape the last crispy bits from the skillet. Every household had its own way of making them. Some liked them soft and steamy, others crisped to perfection with a little char around the edges. No matter how they came out, they always hit the spot. These fried potatoes weren't just food, they were a ritual, a memory, a comfort that cost almost nothing, but gave everything back. In an age of air fryers and drive-thrus, there's something grounding about a dish that asks for so little and gives so much. Fried taters and onions were proof that sometimes the best meals are just one skillet away. Pinto beans with fatback. Pinto beans with fatback was the backbone of countless Appalachian tables, the kind of meal that spoke of hard work, simple living, and deep flavor. When money was tight and meat was scarce, a pot of beans simmering on the stove promised comfort by evening. The magic came from the fatback, a salted strip of pork belly that turned plain beans into something rich and smoky. As it cooked low and slow, the fatback melted into the broth, seasoning the beans with just enough salt and depth to make every spoonful taste like home. This dish wasn't about luxury, it was about making the most of what you had. Dried pintos soaked overnight, boiled in a heavy pot, and cooked until tender enough to mash with the back of a spoon. Some families threw in an onion, a dash of black pepper, or even a splash of vinegar at the end for brightness. And when the beans were finally ready, they were served with cornbread, always cornbread, to soak up that savory broth that locals called pot liquor. It wasn't wasteful cooking, it was resourceful cooking, the kind that built tradition out of necessity. For many, this was the flavor of family gatherings, Sunday suppers, and humble pride. Pinto beans with fatback fed coal miners, farmers, and big families with small budgets, yet no one went to bed hungry. Today, it might be called heritage cooking or farmhouse fare, but back then, it was just dinner. And somehow that made it taste even better. Pinto beans with fatback reminds us that good food doesn't need fancy ingredients, just time, patience, and the kind of know-how that turns a few simple things into a feast worth remembering. Chicken and dumplings. There's something almost sacred about a pot of chicken and dumplings bubbling away on the stove. The smell alone could fill a house with warmth and hope, even on the leanest of days. This wasn't just supper, it was a family event. Born from hard times, this dish took a single chicken, some flour, a little milk, and a lot of care, turning them into something that felt like a Sunday feast any day of the week. The trick was in the stretching, making one bird feed a whole family by letting the dumplings do the heavy lifting. Every Southern and Appalachian cook had their way of making it. Some rolled their dumplings flat and cut them into ribbons. Others dropped them by the spoonful so they puffed up like soft clouds in the bubbling broth. The chicken, boiled first to make the stock, was pulled apart and stirred back in, making every bite tender and flavorful. The broth thickened slightly as the dumplings cooked, creating that creamy, cozy consistency that wrapped around your heart as much as your stomach. This was the kind of meal that brought everyone to the table without calling. A bowl of chicken and dumplings didn't just feed you, it comforted you. It reminded families that you didn't need fancy cuts of meat or expensive ingredients to eat well, just time, patience, and a steady hand with a rolling pin. These days, it's easy to buy frozen dumplings or canned soup versions, but they'll never match the magic of the homemade kind, the one your grandma stirred with a wooden spoon while humming in the kitchen. Chicken and dumplings is proof that the best meals are born not from abundance, but from love, thrift, and a little old-fashioned kitchen wisdom. Fried green tomatoes. Before they became a Southern delicacy with a movie named after them, fried green tomatoes were simply a clever way to keep food from going to waste. When the first frost came too soon and tomatoes hadn't ripened on the vine, thrifty cooks refused to let them rot. Instead, they sliced those firm, tangy greens, dredged them in cornmeal, and fried them until golden and crisp. What began as an act of resourcefulness quickly became a favorite. Crunchy on the outside, tart and tender inside, the perfect balance of texture and taste. In Appalachian and Southern kitchens, this dish was a symbol of pride and practicality. You didn't need ripe produce or fancy sides, just a skillet, a bit of lard or bacon grease, and a few pinches of salt. Some cooks dipped the slices in buttermilk before coating them, adding that signature tang, while others swore by a dusting of flour and cornmeal straight up. They'd sizzle until each slice looked like sunshine caught in cast iron. Served hot, they were eaten plain with a dollop of mayo or stacked on bread for a makeshift sandwich. Fried green tomatoes weren't just a way to save the harvest. They were a reminder of the creativity born from necessity. They spoke to the heart of Hillbilly in Southern cooking. Waste nothing, flavor everything. Today you'll find them in fancy restaurants topped with aioli or goat cheese, but they'll never beat the ones cooked on a farmhouse stove, grease popping, laughter echoing, and the smell of cornmeal in the air. In their humble way, fried green tomatoes prove that good cooking isn't about having everything. It's about making the best of what you've got and loving every bite of it. Sawmill gravy and biscuits. Sawmill gravy and biscuits wasn't just breakfast, it was survival food with a side of comfort. Born in lumber camps and rural kitchens, this dish kept hardworking folks fueled through long days in the woods or on the farm. When meat was scarce, cooks saved every drop of bacon grease or sausage drippings to make a rich, peppery gravy that could turn a simple plate of biscuits into a full meal. The name sawmill came from those early workers who needed something hearty, cheap, and fast, something that could stick to their ribs and keep them going until sundown. The magic was in the roux, a bit of flour whisked into hot grease until it browned just enough to smell nutty, then thinned with milk to create that creamy white gravy everyone recognizes. Salt, pepper, and sometimes a crumble of sausage gave it depth, transforming a few pantry scraps into pure comfort. Meanwhile, biscuits, fluffy, golden, and often baked in the same cast iron skillet, waited on the side, ready to be split open and smothered. When the gravy soaked into the biscuit's tender crumb, it was the kind of meal that made you forget how little it cost to make. Sawmill gravy and biscuits became a Southern staple, but its roots are pure blue-collar ingenuity. Make something out of nothing and make it taste good. Every cook had their trick. More pepper for heat, a splash of coffee in the pan for color, or a pinch of sugar to balance the salt. Today it's served in diners and brunch spots across America, often dressed up, but it still carries the same humble charm. It's the taste of early mornings, of hard work ahead, and of knowing that a warm biscuit and a ladle of gravy can make the world feel right again. Cabbage and salt pork stew. Cabbage and salt pork stew was a dish born from lean times and full hearts, a humble pot that turned scraps into sustenance. When money was tight and meat was precious, salt pork was the old-timer's secret weapon, a small slab of cured fat that flavored everything it touched. Paired with cabbage, onions, and a few rough-cut potatoes, it made a meal that could feed a crowd for pennies. This stew wasn't fancy, it was survival food, stretching a little salt, a little fat, and a lot of patience into something that felt like home. The process was simple but slow, the kind of cooking that filled the house with warmth on a cold day. The salt pork was simmered first to release its smoky richness. Then cabbage was added, softening into ribbons that soaked up the flavor. Potatoes or beans often joined the pot, thickening the broth and making it heartier. Some cooks tossed in vinegar for a little bite, or a sprinkle of red pepper to wake up the taste buds. Every family had their version, each pot slightly different, but always comforting in the same way. This stew wasn't just food, it was a reflection of resourcefulness and gratitude. Farmers, miners, and mill workers alike came home to it after long shifts, their boots muddy and their bellies empty. It reminded them that even the simplest ingredients, when handled with care, could feel like a feast. Today, you'll still find old-timers swearing by it, simmering a pot on the back burner, just like Mama used to. Cabbage and salt pork stew might not look like much, but its story is written in every steaming bowl. A reminder that good cooking has never been about luxury. It's about making the best of what you've got and sharing it with the ones you love. Soup bone stew. Soup bone stew was the original waste not, want not supper, a dish that turned what others might toss aside into pure, stick-to-your-ribs comfort. Back in the day, farmers and hill folk knew the value of a good marrow bone. It wasn't just a scrap, it was the foundation of flavor. Those bones, often left behind after butchering, were simmered for hours until every drop of goodness had melted into the pot. The result? A broth so rich, it could make plain potatoes taste like Sunday dinner. This stew began with simplicity and patience. A big kettle of water, a few soup bones, and time, lots of it. As the bones bubbled away, onions, carrots, and turnips were tossed in, maybe a handful of barley if the pantry allowed. The scent alone could bring the whole family into the kitchen, waiting with bowls in hand. What made it special wasn't just the flavor, it was the transformation. Something humble and forgotten was reborn into something hearty and nourishing. The longer it cooked, the better it got. The meat sliding off the bone, the broth turning cloudy and rich with marrow. In the old mountain kitchens, soup bone stew wasn't just food. It was proof of good sense and gratitude. Families didn't waste a thing because they couldn't afford to. Every bone was stretched, every drop saved for the next meal. And somehow that thriftiness created one of the most soulful dishes you could imagine. Today we call it bone broth and sell it in fancy jars. But the old folks were doing it long before it was trendy. They knew what we're all relearning. Flavor comes from patience, not price tags. Soup bone stew is more than a recipe. It's a lesson simmered in time, reminding us that real comfort starts with what's already in the pot. Cornbread and milk. Cornbread and milk was the poor man's dessert, breakfast, and midnight snack rolled into one humble bowl. In the old Appalachian kitchens, it wasn't fancy, but it didn't need to be. A leftover wedge of cornbread, crumbled into a glass or bowl, drowned in cold milk straight from the icebox or the cow, depending on where you lived. Sometimes sweetened with a spoon of sugar, sometimes salted just a bit. It was whatever comfort meant to you that day. This dish was born from thrift and simplicity. Cornmeal was cheap, filling, and always on hand. When bread went stale, no one threw it out. They turned it into something new. A bit of milk gave it life again, turning dry crumbs into soft, creamy spoonfuls that tasted like childhood. For farmers and mill workers, this was the quick fix after a long day in the fields or mines. It didn't take time, it didn't take money, it just took a bit of what was left. Some folks liked it with buttermilk, tangy and thick, giving the dish a richer flavor that could wake up tired taste buds. Others swore by sweet milk and a drizzle of sorghum or honey for an evening treat. No matter the version, it was all about resourcefulness and satisfaction, making the most of what you had and loving it anyway. Today, it might sound too plain for our modern palates, but there's something quietly beautiful about it. No recipe, no rules, just cornbread, milk, and a moment of peace at the end of a long day. It's the taste of home when the cupboards are nearly empty, the sound of a spoon scraping the last bite, and a reminder that comfort doesn't need to be complicated. Cornbread and milk, simple, honest, and deeply American. Fried corn pone. Fried corn pone was the kind of meal that started as a necessity and ended up as a comfort food no one wanted to let go of. In the old mountain kitchens, it was born out of the same bowl that made biscuits, cornbread, and hush puppies, just cornmeal, salt, a splash of water or buttermilk, and maybe a bit of fat if you could spare it. But instead of baking, folks fried it right in the skillet until it turned crisp and golden on the outside, with a soft, steamy center that could stand on its own or soak up whatever gravy was nearby. It was cheap, sturdy food, something you could make with what little was left in the sack. During the Great Depression or hard winters in the hills, cornmeal kept families going. No yeast, no oven, no us, just a hot pan and determination. Some shaped the pone into patties, others pressed it flat like a cake. And when that sizzle hit the pan, the smell alone felt like hope. Fried corn pone could be breakfast, lunch, or supper, depending on what you paired it with. A slice alongside soup beans or stewed greens made a full meal. Drizzle on molasses, and suddenly it was dessert. The best part, you could eat it hot or cold at the table or out in the field. It was food that followed you through the day. These days, you'd be hard-pressed to find someone frying corn pone outside of a family reunion or church supper. But that doesn't make it any less worthy. Fried corn pone is a taste of resilience, a skillet-born reminder that the simplest foods made from what's left in the pantry often end up being the most unforgettable. Tater cakes, leftover mashed potato patties. Tater cakes were the ultimate make-do meal, born out of the simple rule that nothing in a country kitchen ever went to waste. When mashed potatoes from supper sat cold in the bowl the next morning, Hillbilly cooks didn't toss them out. They mixed them up with a little flour, an egg if one was handy, maybe a sprinkle of onions or bacon grease. and fried the patties right in the same skillet that cooked breakfast. The result? Golden brown cakes, crispy on the outside and creamy in the middle. Comfort disguised as leftovers. These potato patties were the backbone of resourceful living. Every bit of food had to stretch, especially during lean years or after long winters when fresh produce was scarce. Turning cold potatoes into something hot and new wasn't just clever, it was survival with flavor. For many Appalachian families, tater cakes were eaten alongside eggs and biscuits for breakfast, or with soup, beans, and greens for supper. Sometimes, they were even tucked into lunch pails for a hearty snack that stayed good all day. The beauty of tater cakes was their flexibility. Add chopped ham or onions if you have them, or keep them plain for dipping into gravy or ketchup. Every household had its own way, passed down quietly through trial, error, and hunger. Today, we might call it sustainability or zero-waste cooking, but back then, it was just common sense. There's something poetic about that, turning what's left into something worth remembering. Tater cakes remind us that good cooking isn't about abundance, it's about ingenuity. With just a spoonful of mashed potatoes and a hot pan, those old cooks could create a meal that filled bellies and hearts alike. Fried bologna and egg sandwiches. Fried bologna and egg sandwiches were the hillbilly answer to a diner breakfast. Fast, filling, and made with whatever was left in the fridge. In many working-class homes, bologna was the poor man's ham, a cheap meat that still felt like a treat when fried just right. Toss a few slices in a hot skillet, let the edges curl and sizzle, then slap them between 2 slices of white bread with a fried egg and maybe a dab of mustard or mayo. That was breakfast, lunch, or supper, whatever the day called for. This sandwich earned its fame in factory towns and coal camps, where folks needed something hearty before a long shift. Eggs came from the coop out back, bologna from the corner store, and the rest was pure improvisation. Some added cheese, others a slice of tomato in summer. And if you were lucky enough to have fresh biscuits instead of bread, that was high living right there. Fried bologna and egg sandwiches carried the scent of home. Grease popping in the pan, coffee brewing nearby, and someone humming to the radio. It wasn't healthy food, but it was honest food, the kind that fueled real work. In every bite was the taste of thrift and satisfaction. A meal that didn't need to apologize for being simple. These days, you might spot a gourmet version on a brunch menu, but nothing beats the old way. Cheap bologna, a skillet with some miles on it, and a cook who knows how to flip an egg without breaking the yolk. Fried bologna and egg sandwiches may have been born from hard times, but they live on because they're good times food too. A greasy, crispy reminder that comfort doesn't have to come with a price tag. Hoover stew. Hoover stew was the casserole of survival, an all-in-one pot of whatever you had, stirred together during the hungry years of the Great Depression. Named after President Herbert Hoover, who caught much of the blame for the hard times, this dish became a staple in government relief kitchens and home tables alike. It wasn't fancy, but it was filling. A mix of macaroni, canned tomatoes, beans, and sliced hot dogs or ground meat when luck allowed. Cheap, hot, and easy to stretch. It was the definition of making something out of nothing. In those days, folks lined up for food at community centers where large pots of Hoover stew bubbled on the stove, feeding entire families for pennies. Housewives learned to recreate it at home, adjusting the recipe with whatever was on hand. Sometimes adding corn, sometimes peas, or maybe a handful of rice to make it go further. It was Depression-era ingenuity at its finest. A meal that didn't waste, didn't judge, and didn't require much more than a pot and a prayer. The taste? Tangy from the tomatoes, hearty from the pasta, with that salty bite of hot dogs cutting through. It wasn't gourmet, but to hungry bellies, it was pure comfort. Kids loved it, adults depended on it, and everyone was grateful to have something warm to fill the bowl. Today, Hoover stew lives on as a reminder of resilience, a dish that proved good food doesn't need luxury ingredients, just resourcefulness and heart. You can still find the recipe passed down in church cookbooks or family scrapbooks, often scribbled in pencil beside the words, "feeds a crowd." In every spoonful is the story of people who refused to go hungry, who turned scarcity into sustenance, and who found hope in a humble pot of stew. Beans and fried fatback. Beans and fried fatback was a dinner built on survival, but somehow it tasted like satisfaction. This humble pairing came straight from the rural kitchens of the South and Appalachian Hills, where money was scarce, but ingenuity was never in short supply. Dried beans, usually pintos or navy, were soaked overnight, simmered all day, and seasoned with a slab of fried fatback. That salty, crispy strip of cured pork acted as both flavor and feast, turning a pot of beans into a meal that could feed a family without breaking the bank. In those days, folks didn't waste a thing. Fatback came from the side of the hog, too tough for frying like bacon, but perfect for seasoning pots of beans, greens, or cabbage. When it hit the skillet, the kitchen filled with a smell that said, "Dinner's almost ready." The rendered grease was liquid gold poured back into the beans for depth and richness. Some added a chopped onion or a splash of vinegar to cut through the salt. Others swore the magic was in keeping it simple. Around supper time, families would gather at worn wooden tables, ladling beans into chipped bowls and topping them with a crumble of fried fatback. Maybe there was cornbread on the side, maybe just a glass of cold milk. But either way, it filled the belly and soothed the spirit. Today, it might seem too plain for modern menus, but back then, beans and fried fatback was the definition of making do. It wasn't about presentation, it was about preservation. A dish born from necessity, kept alive by memory, and still beloved by anyone who knows that good food doesn't need frills, just flavor and heart. Venison gravy over biscuits. Venison gravy over biscuits was a taste of the hunt, turned into comfort on the kitchen table. In rural Appalachia, hunting wasn't just a pastime. It was a way to put protein on the plate when the pantry was thin. A tender cut of venison, browned and simmered with onions, flour, and a bit of fat, became a rich gravy that could dress up the simplest biscuits. Every spoonful carried the smoky depth of the woods, the flavor of patience, and the pride of doing more with less. The biscuits themselves were often baked from scratch in a cast iron skillet, light and fluffy, ready to soak up every drop of the savory gravy. Leftover venison from the hunt or a small roast could feed a family for several meals, and transforming it into a gravy made it stretch even further. Some cooks added a dash of black pepper or a splash of cream to round out the flavor, while others relied purely on the meat's richness. It was rustic cooking at its finest, practical, frugal, and deeply satisfying. This dish was more than nourishment. It was tradition. Families gathered around the table, hands sticky with buttered biscuits, sharing stories of the hunt and the day's work. Venison gravy over biscuits was a dish that celebrated resourcefulness, turning game into a meal that felt celebratory without costing a fortune. Today, it might appear on a brunch menu or at a country inn, dressed up for modern tastes, but the heart of the dish remains unchanged. It's proof that with a little skill, a little time, and respect for your ingredients, even the simplest bounty can become a meal worth savoring. Venison gravy over biscuits reminds us that comfort and tradition often live in the most unassuming plates. Cabbage and noodles, Appalachian haluski. Cabbage and noodles, or Appalachian haluski, was the kind of meal that whispered thrift and shouted comfort at the same time. Rooted in Eastern European traditions and carried over by immigrant families into the Appalachian hills, this dish turned simple pantry staples, egg noodles, cabbage, and a bit of fatback or butter, into a plateful of soul-soothing satisfaction. It wasn't fancy, but it had heart, and in kitchens where every ingredient counted, that was enough. The preparation was straightforward, but required patience and attention. The cabbage was sliced thin, sautéed until soft and fragrant, while noodles boiled just shy of tender perfection. Rendered fatback or a pat of butter brought it all together, coating each noodle and cabbage ribbon in a glossy, flavorful sheen. A pinch of salt, a crack of black pepper, and sometimes a sprinkle of onions or garlic turned humble ingredients into something that could feed a family for days. Leftovers. They were just as good, often fried the next day into a crispy, savory breakfast treat. Haluski was more than a meal. It was a tradition passed from immigrant mothers to Appalachian daughters, a lesson in making the most of what you had. Families gathered at creaky tables, sharing bowls full of warmth and the kind of flavor that only comes from slow, loving cooking. It was frugal, yes, but never tasteless. Proof that necessity often breeds creativity in the kitchen. Today, you might see gourmet versions with pancetta or specialty noodles, but the old Appalachian haluski remains simple, hearty, and utterly satisfying. It's a dish that reminds us comfort doesn't come from extravagance, it comes from care, from tradition, and from the knowledge that good food can be born from humble beginnings. Chicken and rice bake, busy day chicken. Chicken and rice bake, often nicknamed busy day chicken, was the original weeknight lifesaver. In Appalachian and rural kitchens, it was the dish that could feed a family without demanding all afternoon over the stove. A whole chicken or a few pieces, some leftover rice, a splash of milk or cream, and a handful of pantry staples, maybe onions, a can of mushroom soup, or a sprinkle of cheese, were all you needed. Toss it in a casserole dish, slide it into the oven, and let the heat do the work while you tend to chores, kids, or whatever the day throws at you. The beauty of this dish was its simplicity and versatility. The rice absorbed the chicken's flavor, becoming soft, creamy, and comforting, while the meat stayed tender, seasoned by whatever was on hand. Some cooks added vegetables like carrots, peas, or celery, stretching the dish further and giving it color. The top might brown to a gentle crust, giving a satisfying texture against the soft interior, a humble nod to the effort that went into making a meal that felt substantial without being complicated. This casserole was more than convenience food. It was an act of love and practicality. Busy families, coal miners, and farmhands came home to it, grateful for a warm, filling dinner that didn't require hours of labor. It was a dish that embraced the idea of frugality while still tasting indulgent. Today, casseroles might get fancy with gourmet cheeses or trendy proteins, but busy day chicken remains a testament to straightforward, reliable cooking. It's proof that comfort food doesn't have to be complicated, just wholesome, hearty, and ready to save the day when life gets hectic. Chicken and rice bake reminds us that sometimes the simplest dishes leave the longest lasting memories. Fried apple fritters. Fried apple fritters were the ultimate sweet indulgence born from resourcefulness, the kind of treat that made an ordinary kitchen feel like a country fair. In Appalachian homes, when apples were plentiful from orchards or trees, no one let a single one go to waste. They were chopped, spiced with cinnamon or nutmeg, mixed into a simple flour batter, and dropped by spoonfuls into hot grease until golden and crisp. The result was a warm, sweet, slightly tart fritter that could satisfy a child's craving or a grown-up's late-night indulgence. And these fritters weren't about finesse. They were about heart and timing. Every kitchen had its own rhythm. The sizzle of the skillet, the smell of sugar caramelizing, the hush as the first batch hit the plate. Some families dusted them with powdered sugar, others drizzled syrup or honey on top. Leftovers were often eaten cold, tucked into lunch pails or breakfast plates, the crisp exterior softening but the flavor holding strong. It was a humble dessert that required no oven and only a handful of ingredients, yet delivered a taste that felt special. Fried apple fritters also carried a sense of celebration. They weren't made every day, but when the orchard produced and time allowed, they were the reward for preserving, picking, and cooking with care. A plate of fritters could draw neighbors together, shared with a laugh and a cup of coffee or cider. Today, you might find them in trendy cafes, dressed with caramel or whipped cream. But the original fritter has a simplicity and warmth that can't be duplicated. Fried apple fritters remind us that comfort food is often born from what's on hand, with a dash of creativity, a pinch of patience, and a whole lot of love. Liver and onions. Liver and onions was the blue-collar classic that separated the brave from the faint of heart at the supper table. Once a staple in working-class kitchens, this dish turned a humble organ meat, often beef or pork liver, into a flavorful, nourishing meal when prepared right. Sliced thin, dredged in flour, and pan-fried in a bit of bacon grease or butter, the liver developed a rich, slightly metallic flavor that paired beautifully with sweet, caramelized onions. It wasn't fancy, but it was filling, cheap, and packed with nutrients that families couldn't always afford in other forms. This dish thrived on simplicity and timing. The onions were sliced thin and cooked slowly until they released their natural sugars, softening into golden ribbons that draped over the liver like a savory crown. Some cooks added a splash of vinegar or a pinch of black pepper to cut the richness, while others relied purely on the interplay of fat and sweetness. Served alongside mashed potatoes, cornbread, or a few boiled vegetables, it was a meal that could satisfy even the hungriest laborer after a long day. For many, liver and onions carried the flavor of thrift and resilience. It was a dish passed down from parents who had grown up in tough times, learning to make every part of an animal count. Eating it was as much about nourishment as it was about tradition, and every bite told the story of resourcefulness in the kitchen. Today, it may be considered an acquired taste, often replaced by steaks and more familiar cuts of meat. But for those who grew up on it, liver and onions remains comfort food at its most honest, rich, hearty, and unapologetically simple. It's proof that sometimes the most unassuming ingredients can leave the deepest impression on the family table. Neck bone soup. Neck bone soup was the quintessential stretch it as far as you can meal, a humble dish that turned leftover or inexpensive cuts into liquid gold. In Appalachian and Southern kitchens, neck bones from pork or beef weren't discarded. They were simmered slowly in a pot of water, releasing rich flavor, fat, and collagen that made the broth hearty and nourishing. Into that broth went vegetables like onions, carrots, and potatoes, sometimes a handful of beans or cabbage, turning what began as scraps into a full, satisfying meal. It wasn't just dinner, it was survival with flavor, a dish that could feed a family on the tightest budget. Cooking neck bone soup requires patience. The bones had to simmer low and slow, hours of gentle bubbling until the meat softened and the marrow enriched the broth. Onions caramelized, potatoes absorbed flavor, and the aroma that filled the house could draw even the laziest family member to the table. Salt and pepper were often the only seasonings, but the depth of flavor was enough to make everyone ask for seconds. Leftovers were almost better the next day. the flavors melding into an even richer, comforting stew. This soup carried more than taste, it carried tradition. Families relied on it during hard winters, after long days in the fields, or when payday was still a week away. It was humble, yes, but it symbolized care, resourcefulness, and respect for every part of the animal. Today, neck bones might be overshadowed by fancier cuts or store-bought broths, but in the kitchens that remember, neck bone soup remains a testament to frugality and flavor. It's proof that patience, ingenuity, and a few simple ingredients can turn scraps into a meal worth savoring, a dish that warms both body and heart. Hog maw and potatoes. Hog maw and potatoes was a dish that whispered frugality but shouted flavor, a staple in Appalachian and Pennsylvania Dutch kitchens alike. Hog maw, the stomach of the pig, cleaned and prepared, was stuffed or simmered with a mix of potatoes, onions, and seasonings until tender, turning what might have been discarded into a hearty, filling meal. This was cooking born out of necessity. Every part of the hog mattered, and nothing went to waste. Yet, despite its humble origins, the dish carried a rustic richness that made it memorable at any family table. Preparation was simple but required care. Potatoes were peeled and cut into chunks, onions sliced thin, and together they simmered slowly with the hog maw, soaking up the savory, meaty flavors. Some households added a bit of sage or black pepper, while others kept it plain, letting the natural taste of the meat and potatoes shine. The slow cooking rendered the fat and tenderized the stomach, creating a stew-like consistency that was satisfying and deeply comforting. Hog maw and potatoes wasn't just food, it was a tradition. It fed farmers, miners, and families who worked hard all day, providing a meal that was filling, economical, and full of character. Leftovers were often fried up the next day, making the flavors even more concentrated and the dish a favorite for breakfast or lunch. Today, it's a rare find on modern menus, often seen only at church suppers or heritage food festivals, but hog maw and potatoes remain a symbol of resourcefulness and culinary ingenuity. It reminds us that good food doesn't require extravagance, just patience, respect for ingredients, and the know-how to turn the overlooked into the unforgettable. Cornmeal mush with syrup or gravy. Cornmeal mush with syrup or gravy was the humble breakfast that could be sweet, savory, or somewhere in between, depending on the household's pantry and mood. Made from simple cornmeal, water or milk, and a pinch of salt. The mush was cooked slowly until it thickened into a creamy, soft porridge. Once set and sliced, it could be fried in a hot skillet to develop a crisp, golden exterior while staying tender inside. From there, it was ready to be topped. Sugar or syrup for a morning treat, or savory gravy for a hearty start to a workday. This dish thrived in Appalachian and Southern kitchens because it was cheap, filling, and versatile. Cornmeal was shelf-stable, accessible, and stretched a long way, making it an ideal staple during lean seasons or after a long winter. Families would often serve it alongside eggs, bacon, or beans, transforming a basic ingredient into a satisfying meal. The frying step elevated the texture, turning a simple mush into something warm, fragrant, and comforting. Cornmeal mush wasn't just sustenance, it was a reflection of resourcefulness. It required minimal ingredients, yet fed a hungry family with flavor and satisfaction. The toppings, whether sweet syrup from a neighbor's maple tree or savory gravy made from drippings, showcased the cook's creativity and adaptability. Today, it may seem quaint compared to instant cereals or boxed pancakes, but cornmeal mush with syrup or gravy carries the nostalgia of slow mornings, cozy kitchens, and frugal ingenuity. It reminds us that comfort food doesn't have to be complicated. just thoughtfully prepared, lovingly served, and meant to fill both the stomach and the soul. Fried cabbage with bacon drippings. Fried cabbage with bacon drippings was the kind of dish that turned humble ingredients into unforgettable flavor, a mainstay in Appalachian and Southern kitchens, where thrift and taste went hand in hand. The secret was simple. Leftover cabbage, sliced thin, sautéed in the smoky, savory drippings left over from frying bacon. What might seem plain on paper became a fragrant, golden, and slightly crisp side dish that could accompany nearly any meal, from cornbread to roast pork. Preparation required little more than a hot skillet and patience. The bacon was fried first, releasing rich, flavorful fat. Then the cabbage went in, slowly cooking until tender and infused with that signature smokiness. Some cooks added a splash of vinegar or a pinch of sugar to balance flavors, while others kept it minimalist, letting the drippings do all the work. The result was a dish that was comforting, economical, and deeply satisfying, the kind of side that made even the simplest supper feel like a feast. This dish carried more than flavor. It carried tradition. Families relied on it to stretch meals, turning inexpensive cabbage into something that felt indulgent. The sizzling sound, the aroma filling the kitchen, and the sight of golden edges curling in the skillet were all part of the experience, connecting generations through taste. Today, it might be overshadowed by trendy sides or exotic vegetables, but fried cabbage with bacon drippings remains a testament to culinary ingenuity. It's proof that you don't need expensive ingredients to create something memorable. Just care, patience, and a skillet full of love. Every forkful is a reminder that comfort and history can live in the simplest of dishes. Pork and beans. Bake with molasses. Pork and beans, baked with molasses, was the kind of dish that could feed a family, warm the belly, and sweeten the soul, all without costing a fortune. Born in Appalachian and rural kitchens, it combined humble pantry staples, dried or canned beans, bits of salt pork or fatback, and a generous splash of molasses to give the dish depth and richness. The beans slowly absorbed the sweet, smoky flavors as the casserole baked, turning simple ingredients into a meal that felt hearty, satisfying, and distinctly homemade. Preparation was straightforward but required time and care. Beans were soaked overnight, then layered with small cubes of pork or bacon, drizzled with molasses, and baked until tender and bubbly. Onions or a pinch of pepper might be added for subtle complexity, but the magic was in the slow melding of sweet, salty, and smoky flavors. Leftovers only improved, making it a go-to dish for busy households or large families who needed meals to stretch across the week. Pork and beans bake wasn't just about filling bellies, it was about ingenuity and resilience. It showcased how resourceful cooks could transform a few inexpensive ingredients into something celebratory, teaching generations the value of patience, thrift, and flavor. Families gathered around the table, ladling generous portions onto plates, often accompanied by cornbread or a simple salad, enjoying a meal that was more than sustenance, it was comfort. Today, it may be overshadowed by canned convenience versions or trendy casseroles, but pork and beans baked with molasses remains a testament to humble ingenuity. Every sweet, smoky bite tells the story of a person who made the most of what they had, turning simplicity into a dish worth remembering, sharing, and savoring. Squirrel stew. Squirrel stew was a dish born of necessity, ingenuity, and a touch of rural bravado, a staple in Appalachian and Southern kitchens where hunting supplemented the larder. Squirrels, plentiful in the woods and easy to trap, became more than just protein. They were the centerpiece of a hearty, slow-cooked stew that could feed a family on a tight budget. simmered with root vegetables like potatoes, carrots, and onions, and seasoned simply with salt, pepper, and perhaps a dash of herbs. The stew transformed humble game into a rich, comforting meal. Cooking squirrel required patience and respect for the meat. The stew began with browning the meat to lock in flavor, then adding water or stock, and letting it bubble gently for hours. Vegetables were added in stages so that each piece maintained texture and sweetness, soaking up the savory broth. Some cooks thinned the stew slightly with milk or cream. Others left it rustic and thick, served with cornbread or biscuits to mop up every drop. The aroma alone could draw a tired family to the table, promising warmth and sustenance. Squirrel stew carried more than taste. It carried tradition. It was a dish passed down from generations who understood the rhythms of the forest, the value of thrift, and the magic of turning foraged or hunted ingredients into nourishment. It fed farmers, loggers, and children after long days of work and play, and it taught self-reliance in every simmering pot. Today, squirrel is rare on menus and even rarer in city kitchens. But squirrel stew remains a symbol of resourcefulness and rural culinary wisdom. It reminds us that comfort and flavor aren't about extravagance. They're about patience, respect for ingredients, and knowing how to make the most of what the land provides. Sweet potato hash with sausage. Sweet potato hash with sausage was the kind of breakfast or supper that could wake up a kitchen with its color, aroma, and hearty flavor. In Appalachian homes and rural farmhouses, sweet potatoes, often grown in backyard gardens, were inexpensive, filling, and versatile. Combined with small bits of pork sausage or leftover breakfast meat, diced onions, and a touch of seasoning, they became a skillet dish that was both comforting and practical. Every piece of potato caramelized slightly in the pan, mingling with savory sausage juices and onions, creating a dish that was sweet, smoky, and satisfying all at once. Preparation was simple but intentional. Sweet potatoes were peeled, diced, and par-cooked if needed, then fried with the sausage over medium heat until tender and lightly crisped on the edges. Some households added a pinch of paprika, black pepper, or even a dash of molasses to balance the flavors. The beauty of this hash was its flexibility. It could be served with eggs for breakfast, alongside biscuits for lunch, or with a fried apple for a touch of sweetness at supper. Leftovers? Reheated in the skillet, they were just as delicious, with flavors deepening overnight. Sweet potato hash with sausage wasn't just about feeding the body, it was about feeding the spirit. It reflected ingenuity, using whatever was on hand to create a meal that was more than the sum of its parts. Families gathered around the table, scraping the skillet clean, enjoying both the taste and the shared effort it took to make it. Today, with fancy brunch menus and gourmet hashes, it's easy to forget how humble ingredients can become star dishes. Sweet potato hash with sausage reminds us that comfort food often comes from thrift, skill, and a willingness to let simple ingredients shine. Proof that the best meals are sometimes the easiest to love. Souped up ramen, mountain noodles. Souped up ramen, affectionately called mountain noodles in many rural kitchens, was the clever answer to a fast, frugal, and filling meal. Ramen noodles, cheap and shelf-stable, were elevated far beyond their instant origins with a handful of vegetables, a bit of leftover meat, and a splash of whatever broth was on hand. In households where resources were tight, this dish became a way to stretch a small package of noodles into a dinner that could feed an entire family, warming bellies and hearts alike. The preparation was simple but transformative. Noodles were boiled until tender, then combined with chopped onions, carrots, or cabbage, along with diced ham, bacon, or chicken scraps. A seasoning packet might be supplemented with herbs, black pepper, or a dash of vinegar to add depth. The result was a hearty, flavorful noodle soup that tasted far richer than its humble ingredients suggested. For extra comfort, some cooks finished it with a fried egg on top or a sprinkle of cheese, turning the meal into something both practical and indulgent. Mountain noodles carried the spirit of Appalachian ingenuity, taking minimal, inexpensive ingredients and creating a meal that felt like more than the sum of its parts. It was quick enough for a busy evening, yet satisfying enough to linger over at the table. Families ate it together, often with buttered bread on the side, sharing warmth and conversation as they slurped the savory noodles. Today, ramen has gone gourmet, with trendy toppings and elaborate broths, but the mountain noodles version remains a testament to resourcefulness and comfort. It's proof that a simple package of noodles, a little creativity, and a touch of care can transform even the cheapest pantry staples into a meal worth remembering. Cottage cheese casserole with broth. Cottage cheese casserole with broth was the unassuming hero of frugal kitchens, a dish that turned modest ingredients into a hearty, nourishing meal. In households where every penny and scrap of food counted, cooks combined cottage cheese, rich in protein but inexpensive, with stale bread or noodles, then moistened the mixture with savory broth. The result was a warm, creamy casserole that stretched to feed a family, comforting without relying on luxury ingredients. The preparation was straightforward yet satisfying. Bread cubes or pasta soaked up the broth, while cottage cheese added creaminess and substance. Onions, herbs, or a dash of butter could elevate the flavor. But the real magic was in the melding of textures. Soft, slightly tangy cheese blending with tender starch and flavorful liquid. Baked until golden on top, the casserole developed a light crust while remaining creamy inside, perfect for spooning onto plates straight from the pan. This casserole carried more than flavor. It carried practicality and tradition. It was a way to repurpose leftovers, keep the pantry in rotation, and provide a filling meal with minimal effort. Families gathered around the table, passing the casserole dish back and forth, enjoying a dish that felt comforting and substantial, even if it was born from necessity. Today, cottage cheese casserole with broth might seem plain compared to modern, heavily cheesed or cream-laden bakes, but it remains a testament to resourcefulness and home cooking ingenuity. It reminds us that nourishment and satisfaction often come from simple ingredients thoughtfully combined, and that humble meals can leave lasting impressions, both on the belly and in memory. Fatback and collards. Fatback and collards was a cornerstone of Southern and Appalachian kitchens, a dish that combined thrift, flavor, and tradition in every bite. Collard greens, hearty and abundant in gardens or markets, were slow-cooked with fatback, the cured, fatty side of pork, to infuse the leaves with smoky, savory richness. What might seem like a simple pairing on the surface was actually a deeply satisfying dish, offering protein, fiber, and comfort in one hearty bowl. The preparation was deceptively simple. Fatback was rendered in a pot until it released its flavorful drippings, which became the cooking medium for the collards. The greens were added slowly, simmering until tender, with occasional splashes of water or broth to keep them from drying out. A pinch of salt, a crack of black pepper, and sometimes a dash of vinegar or hot sauce were all that was needed to round out the flavors. The slow cooking brought out the natural sweetness of the collards, perfectly balanced by the smoky pork fat. Fatback and collards wasn't just about sustenance, it was about tradition and resilience. Families relied on it to stretch ingredients while still enjoying a meal that felt hearty and indulgent. It was a dish that could feed workers after long days in the fields, or farmers after early mornings in the barn, connecting generations through flavor and shared experience. Today, this combination might seem old-fashioned, but fatback and collards remains a symbol of resourceful cooking and soulful taste. It reminds us that the simplest ingredients, handled with care and patience, can yield the most memorable and comforting meals, a true testament to the ingenuity and heart of traditional home cooking. Souped-up ramen, mountain noodles. Souped-up ramen, known affectionately in Appalachian homes as mountain noodles, was the genius of frugality in a bowl. Instant noodles, cheap and shelf-stable, became a blank canvas for cooks who stretched every ingredient into a full, hearty meal. With a handful of vegetables, cabbage, carrots, onions, and a bit of leftover meat or sausage, a simple package of ramen could transform into a nourishing dinner that filled the table and satisfied hungry hands. Preparation was quick but deliberate. Noodles were boiled until tender, then drained or left in broth, while vegetables and meat were sautéed in the same pot or skillet to maximize flavor. Seasoning packets were often augmented with pantry staples, black pepper, a splash of vinegar, or a pinch of sugar to deepen the taste. Some cooks even added a fried egg on top, or a handful of cheese for richness. The result was simple, savory, and comforting, the kind of meal that could be on the table in under 30 minutes, but felt like hours of care went into it. Mountain noodles carried the spirit of ingenuity, taking inexpensive, everyday ingredients and turning them into something greater than the sum of their parts. Families ate together, sharing bowls of steaming noodles, scraping the bottom for every bit of broth, and enjoying a quick, satisfying meal born from necessity. Today, ramen has been elevated to gourmet status with trendy toppings and elaborate broths, but the mountain noodles version remains a symbol of creativity and resourcefulness. It reminds us that comfort doesn't require luxury, just a little imagination, a few humble ingredients, and the desire to make something warm and filling from what's on hand. And there you have it. 30 forgotten hillbilly dinners that once filled kitchens, warmed bellies, and brought families together. From humble beans and cornbread to hearty squirrel stew, these dishes remind us that good food doesn't need to be fancy, just made with care and resourcefulness. If any of these meals brought back memories or made you curious to try them, drop a comment and share your favorite. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and pass this video along so more people can rediscover the flavors of the past.